Hello students, this video is being recorded in the summer of 2020. Enjoy the lecture.
Our next speech is Ronald Reagan's A Time for Choosing, a speech that he gave in support of Barry Goldwater, the Republican candidate for president in 1964. Ronald Wilson Reagan was born on February 6, 1911 in Tampico, Illinois. He's pictured here with his parents and his older brother. Because of his haircut, his father gave him the nickname Dutch, a nickname he kept for the rest of his life. In 1920, the family moved to Dixon, Illinois. In the summer of 1926, Ronald Reagan took a job as a lifeguard in Lowell Park in Dixon, and over the next 7 summers was credited with saving 77 lives. In 1928, he graduated from Dixon, Illinois High School. Reagan went on to attend Eureka College and graduated in 1932 with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Sociology. He was also a member of the Tau Kappa Epsilon fraternity. After he graduated, he took a job as a radio announcer with WHO in Des Moines, Iowa. Among the jobs he had for the radio station was a play-by-play announcer for the Chicago Cubs baseball games. In 1937, Reagan took a Hollywood screen test for Warner Brothers and earned himself a 7-year movie contract. In 1940, he married his first wife, actress Jane Wyman. The couple divorced in 1948. Prior to his 1964 speech, A Time for Choosing, Ronald Reagan was principally known as a movie actor. Here is a list of all the Hollywood movies in which Ronald Reagan appeared. Beginning with his first movie in 1937, Love is on the Air. Among his most famous films was Knute Rockne, AllAmerican from 1940, in which Reagan played a University of Notre Dame football player named George Gipp. Here's a famous scene from that film.
George. Yes, Rock. George, this telegram just arrived from Waller Camp. You've been named fullback on his All-American team. Me? You wouldn't kid me, Rock. No, it's on the level. You're gonna be all right, kid. I haven't got a complaint in the world, Rock. Not afraid. What's tough about this? Rock, someday when the team's up against it, breaks are beating the boys, ask them to go in there with all they've got. Win just one for the Kipper. I don't know where I'll be then. But I'll know about it. I'll be happy.
At the same time that Reagan began his Hollywood career, he also enlisted in the Army Reserve as a second lieutenant, and in 1942, during World War II, he was ordered to active duty. In 1943, he was promoted to captain and made part of the 1st Motion Picture Unit. In his Army service in the Motion Picture Unit, Reagan produced and narrated about 400 Army and Army Air Forces training films. He also produced and narrated what we would call propaganda films for public distribution in support of the war effort. Here's a sample of Reagan's narration from one of those propaganda films.
This is an American air base in East Anglia, on the east coast of England. One of many such bases from which American fighter planes swarmed up into battle against the German Air Force. Planes known as the P-47, the Thunderbolt. A fast, tough, high-altitude fighter with a dive like its name, and an 8-gun blast in its wings. Now comes the briefing for the mission, and everybody present. These Thunderbolt pilots are veterans of many missions, so the colonel gives them only the essentials. They are to escort the bombers to a target about 40 miles east of Mannheim, and then proceed to the strafing of aerodromes north of Frankfurt. They're given times of takeoff, rendezvous, escort, strafing. The pilots make notes on the backs or palms of their left hands. Intelligence warns them that they may expect considerable enemy opposition today. The Germans have brought in some 100 single-engine fighters. Our fighters were ordered to range wider, to seek the enemy in the air and on the ground instead of waiting for him. And above all, to follow him to his destruction. A gigantic fighter battle raged across the European skies with victories by our fighters alone of 60, 85, over 100 destroyed each day. The fight came down from almost invisible heights to the final decision, perhaps only a few feet above the ground. Enemy warplanes of every kind and in fantastic numbers were splashed all over the landscape of northwestern Germany and occupied Holland, Belgium, France. This was a crucial battle. Both sides were aware of the coming events with air domination itself at stake. Once again, a better cause, better planning and leadership, better equipment. And beyond everything else, the valor of our fighter pilots gave us victory. Only this time, it was decisive.
In 1945, at the end of the war, Reagan was released from active duty on December 9th. After World War II, Reagan was elected in 1947 as the president of the Screen Actors Guild. He was re-elected 6 more times. This occurred during the Hollywood blacklist era, and among the things Reagan had to do as head of the Actors Union was testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. In 1952, he married actress Nancy Davis, who became his second wife and eventually First Lady of the United States. In 1954, Reagan was hired by General Electric to host General Electric Theater, which was a new weekly television drama series. As part of his contract, he also traveled all around the United States to speak to General Electric employees. In 1960, Reagan earned his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And in 1962, only 2 years before his famous speech, A Time for Choosing, he changed his political party affiliation from Democrat to Republican. Then, in October of 1964, he delivered the speech which is the subject of our lesson today. In his first run for political office, Ronald Reagan was elected governor of California in 1966. Among the things that occupied his attention during his first administration was the Berkeley free speech movement and student demonstrations against the war in Vietnam. In 1968, he briefly considered a presidential candidacy as part of a Stop Nixon movement, but determined that Nixon had earned a sufficient delegate count to win the Republican nomination. In 1970, he was re-elected governor of California, and in 1974 declined an offer from President Gerald Ford to become the United States ambassador to Great Britain. In 1975, he announced that he would seek the 1976 Republican nomination and challenge President Ford in the primaries. Although he made a strong showing and a very good speech at the convention, he lost the nomination to President Ford, who eventually went on to lose the general election to Jimmy Carter. In 1980, Ronald Reagan ran again for the Republican nomination, and later that year, he was elected the 40th president of the United States. Part of Reagan's journey to the White House was the 1980 presidential primary in New Hampshire, the nation's first presidential primary. Reagan won the New Hampshire primary by defeating his closest opponent, George H.W. Bush, and he did so in part because of an event called the Ambush in Nashua. It was a primary debate at which Reagan and Bush were supposed to be the only 2 candidates present, but Reagan invited all the other Republican candidates and did not notify Bush that they had been invited. When the organizers of the debate refused to allow the other candidates to participate and tried to shut off Reagan's microphone, he responded with a famous retort. I'll let you watch it for yourselves.
For the question, you asked me if you could make an announcement first. And I asked you for permission to make an announcement myself.
Would the sound man please turn Mr. Reagan's mic off for a minute?
Is this on? Mr. Green,
Would you turn that microphone
you
off,
asked
please?
for me if you would... I am paying for this microphone, Mr. Green.
President Ronald Reagan spent an eventful 8 years in the White House, and rather than talk about all the different issues that occupied his attention, I want to focus on some of his well-known speeches as president. He, of course, began his presidential administration with his first inaugural address, and a little more than 2 months later survived an assassination attempt. Reagan was shot by John Hinckley. Hinckley was a mentally unstable young man who had a fascination with actress Jodie Foster. She had appeared in Martin Scorsese's film Taxi Driver, and Hinckley wanted to impress Jodie Foster by doing what the character Travis Bickle did in the movie, and that was assassinate an important political figure. Reagan was shot along with his press secretary James Brady, a Washington, D.C. police officer, and a Secret Service agent. Later in 1981, the president addressed the nation on the air traffic controllers' strike. He threatened to fire all the air traffic controllers if they did not return to work. When they refused, he did indeed fire them and replace them with military air traffic controllers and supervisors. In 1982, he gave a speech before the British Parliament. He said then that the march of freedom and democracy will leave Marxism-Leninism on the ash heap of history. In 1983, on the 8th of March, he gave what is known as his Evil Empire speech. This is one of his most famous speeches, which marks out the terms of the global ideological contest between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was very much a Cold War speech. Only 2 weeks later, Reagan made another address in which he talked about the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based defense against ballistic missile attack. The press referred to it as the Star Wars system, and the speech became known as the Star Wars speech. Later in 1983, after a Korean airliner was shot down by a Soviet fighter jet, the president again addressed the nation in a speech that made the American position clear and which heightened tensions with the Soviet Union. On October 27, 1983, the president addressed the nation on the bombing of the Marine barracks in Lebanon, which killed over 200 United States Marines, and the American invasion of the island of Grenada. On June 6, 1984, the president traveled to Normandy, France, and gave an address on the 40th anniversary of D-Day. This commemorative speech was probably his best epideictic oration. In his second term, the president, of course, began with his second inaugural address, given in 1985 on the 21st of January, because the 20th was a Sunday. On May the 5th that year, he gave remarks at Bitburg Cemetery in Germany, commemorating the end of World War II, the 40th anniversary of VE Day. In November of 1985, he gave an address to a joint session of Congress on the Geneva Summit. This was the first summit at which Reagan met with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, and they began the process of reducing nuclear weapons in the world. On January 28, 1986, after the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded upon liftoff, the president spoke to the nation that evening in commemorative remarks honoring the astronauts, including New Hampshire's Krista McAuliffe, who had been killed in the explosion.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista Mikaloff. We mourn their loss as a nation together. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye, and slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God.
On September 14th of 1986, the president appeared on national television in the evening with his wife Nancy to talk about the war on drugs. It was Mrs. Reagan who first used the phrase, "just say no." On October 13th, 1986, he again addressed the nation in the evening on television to talk about the Reykjavik, Iceland summit with Gorbachev. There again, the two leaders made progress on reducing the threat of nuclear holocaust in the world. On March 4th, 1987, Reagan spoke about the Iran-Contra scandal and offered what could be described as his apologia, or speech of self-defense. Later in 1987, he gave his famous speech at the Brandenburg Gate. The speech recalled the address given by President Kennedy there in 1963. This was the speech in which President Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall."
There is one sign that the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Finally, on January 11th, 1989, President Reagan delivered his farewell address. Following his presidency, President Reagan retired to California. In 1991, the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library was dedicated, and in 1994, President Ronald Reagan made his final public appearance at the funeral of former President Richard Nixon. Later in 1994, President Reagan wrote a letter to the nation revealing that he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Ronald Reagan died 10 years later on the 5th of June at the age of 93. Like some of the other distinguished speakers we have studied, he was given a state funeral. So let's take a look at his famous 1964 speech, A Time for Choosing, asking about the genre and also the exigence, the audience, and the constraints. When we talk about the generic classification of this speech, we can say this was a campaign speech. It was in the midst of a presidential campaign, only a week before Americans voted for their next president, and it was a speech given to recommend and support the presidential candidacy of Barry Goldwater. And then, what is the exigence here? It's clear from the speech that Ronald Reagan believed the exigence was fundamentally ideological. He saw an ideological turn in American politics, and he saw an opening or an opportunity to use his rhetorical skill to address that political crisis that he saw looming if Barry Goldwater were not elected president. It's also undeniable that this speech marks the very beginning of Ronald Reagan's political career, though it is hard to say that he had that as a motivating factor when he delivered the speech. And then, who is the audience? Clearly, Reagan is addressing an audience in the auditorium where he is speaking, and his principal audience might be the Republicans who are most closely aligned with the ideological position he articulates. But it is also clear that Reagan must address voters in the middle and independent voters, and perhaps even some Democrats, in order for Goldwater to win. So he has to carve out an audience from among the American electorate, enough people whom he could persuade to vote for Barry Goldwater to become president. And then, what are the constraints? Some of the constraints have to do with the recent political history. Goldwater was running against Lyndon Johnson, and Lyndon Johnson had become president when John Kennedy was assassinated. This was the first opportunity for Americans to support Johnson with their votes. The media had also portrayed Goldwater as an extremist, as someone out of touch with the mainstream of American thinking, and Reagan needs to portray Goldwater as a more tempered character, and we'll see how he does that in the speech. Another constraint might be simply the time. The Republican Party in California had reserved a half hour of broadcast time, and Reagan has a lot of message to get in that 30-minute slot. So here are some critical questions we can ask about Ronald Reagan's A Time for Choosing. How does Reagan establish his ethos and credibility at the beginning of the speech? And then, because Reagan at this time was still known mainly as an actor, is it fair to ask whether the speech was a mere performance? And if so, what role was Ronald Reagan playing here? The speech is entitled A Time for Choosing. In what specific ways does Reagan constrain that choice? In other words, how does his rhetoric seem to make the choice obvious? We could also ask, what sort of worldview or personal philosophy is necessary to credit Reagan's views? In other words, at whom or what type of person is the speech directed, and for whom do these ideas and warnings resonate? The speech was given just before the presidential election of 1964, but how do the issues that Reagan discusses resonate today for an audience of Americans 56 years later? Indeed, as we read the speech and listen to excerpts, we'll see that many of the issues and problems Reagan discusses are with us today, many years later. Then we could ask, what does Reagan do stylistically to emphasize the ideological terms of the choice facing Americans in 1964? Does his rhetoric emphasize difference and division? And if so, how? And then we could ask, what do you think of Reagan's occasional use of narrative within the speech? How does his storytelling function within the overall address? And we'll look at a couple of examples of his use of narrative in a few moments. Do you think Reagan uses sarcasm and ridicule effectively? And to what end? And why does Reagan invoke the names and ideas of the Founding Fathers and other iconic figures from the past, such as Moses and Jesus? What advantage does he gain from these references? Finally, we could ask, since this is ultimately an election campaign speech, how successful is it in recommending the Republican candidate for president, Barry Goldwater? What does Reagan have to say about Goldwater? And who is the Barry Goldwater that is portrayed in the text of Reagan's speech? Is the candidate on whose behalf Reagan speaks overshadowed by Reagan himself? So before we turn to look at the speech, let's take a look at this article by Kurt Ritter entitled Ronald Reagan and the Speech, the rhetoric of public relations politics. And Ritter is referring to the fact that shortly after his speech for Goldwater, Reagan hired a public relations firm to begin his campaign for California governor. As Ritter observed, he opened his unannounced campaign for governor with an expansion of his Goldwater television address, which Reagan called simply the speech, delivered at the annual convention of the conservative California Republican Assembly in San Diego. The convention went wild over the movie and television personality, contributing a standing ovation before and after his 45-minute speech. Ritter then goes on to observe that during the remaining 9 months of 1965, his public relations firm scheduled 150 more speaking engagements. Reagan traveled 10,000 miles to deliver his speech throughout California and across the nation before officially announcing his candidacy for the Republican gubernatorial nomination on January 4th, 1966. The 30-minute announcement address, a retooled version of the speech, was carried on 15 television stations throughout the state. So one of the things we observe here is Ritter is studying not just the original speech for Goldwater, A Time for Choosing, but the different iterations of that speech that Reagan used in the lead up to his announcement that he was running for governor of California. But Ritter also notes that 1964 speech for Goldwater had begun actually 10 years earlier. Reagan started to form his speech in 1954, 10 years before his Goldwater address. In conjunction with his duties as host of the television program GE Theater, he contributed to General Electric's public relations program by speaking to hundreds of routine weekly luncheon clubs, State Chamber of Commerce banquets, and national business conventions. Reagan became an increasingly popular nonpartisan speaker during his 8-year association with General Electric. When GE Theater was canceled in 1962, he had speaking tours booked as far ahead as 1966. This speech, meaning the speech he typically did for the GE audiences, this speech entitled Encroaching Government Controls, warned of communist subversion in the United States and decried the swiftly rising tide of collectivism in America. As Reagan spoke in the Republican campaigns of 1962 and 1964, his speech underwent a kind of evolution, and the attack on big government became his major theme. And certainly we can see that in the speech from 1964 for Barry Goldwater. Now, according to Ritter, in Reagan's unannounced campaign, the speech served a twofold rhetorical strategy: the identification of the actor with diverse political factions and the manipulation of his reputation to present the reasonable picture of a candidate that his public relations firm desired. By adapting the speech to his different audiences, Reagan attempted to retain the confidence of the Republican right wing while publicly modifying his recent position as a political conservative. The televised and published speeches addressed to the general public did not dwell on the communist menace to America, but rather on Reagan's eagerness to solve the problems of age, health, poverty, and housing without compulsion and without fiscal irresponsibility. By emphasizing a positive program in his announcement address, Reagan appeared no more far out than a Rotarian and moved closer to what his public relations firm called Nixon types and Rockefeller supporters. And that ideological mellowing may have been true with regard to Reagan's announcement speech, but I think we can see he hadn't gotten there yet in the Goldwater speech, A Time for Choosing, in 1964. Ritter goes on to remark that in contrast to his publicized speeches, Reagan's unpublished talks to conservative groups stressed the danger of communistic collectivism and the yeast-like growth of government. The California Republican Assembly, which favors repeal of the income tax and wants a complete investigation of the United Nations, heard Reagan warn that our nation is engaged in a contest, a war between philosophies, communism versus capitalism, which will determine whether the nation and way of life our forefathers created can endure. In the face of the all-embraced, all-blood-soaked reality of the communist program, he argued, we must do everything we can to strengthen capitalism and repudiate everything that weakens it. The right-wing version of the speech differed from the moderate version by explicitly citing communism as an exterior enemy to whose philosophy our nation might unwittingly succumb through voluntary slavery to a controlled economy and a proliferation of bureaucratic agencies. Ritter also points out that Reagan's public relations firm wanted to frame him as a suitable candidate for California governor. The second objective of Spencer Roberts and Hafner's rhetorical strategy was to make Reagan appear as a sensible, reasonable guy who had the intellectual capacity to be a state governor. This public relations firm hoped to prove symbolically that Reagan was a good administrator. By speaking from 3x5-inch cards rather than from a manuscript or a memorized text, Reagan gave the impression of a well-informed citizen politician, not of an actor reading his lines. Reagan's well-publicized claim that he had always written his own speeches and done his own research work helped counteract the charge that he knew only what his public relations firm told him. Finally, Ritter concludes that Ronald Reagan's all-purpose speech and unannounced campaign suggest that in today's public relations politics, a state candidate's pre-campaign oratory can effectively promote a planned rhetorical strategy of identifying the candidate with diverse political factions and manipulating his image. With this strategy, the state candidate can create a national reputation as a political spokesman, take advantage of national news media, and later discuss the specific state campaign issues in terms of his national posture. And certainly, his 1964 speech for Barry Goldwater, A Time for Choosing, is where Ronald Reagan launches his national political career. So now, let's listen to some excerpts from A Time for Choosing and offer some critical remarks on those passages. This was a speech that William F. Buckley said was probably the most successful single political broadcast since Mr. Nixon's Checkers speech. And David Broder of the Washington Post said it was the most successful national political debut since William Jennings Bryan electrified the 1896 Democratic Convention with his Cross of Gold speech.
We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the Founding Fathers. Not too long ago, two friends of mine were talking to a Cuban refugee, a businessman who had escaped from Castro. And in the midst of his story, one of my friends turned to the other and said, "We don't know how lucky we are." And the Cuban stopped and said, "How lucky you are. I had some place to escape to." And in that sentence, he told us the entire story. If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
So in this passage, we see, among other things, Reagan's talent for storytelling. It's a very short narrative, but it contains the essence of what he means to communicate. And then we see his ability also to craft the terms of the ideological contest in which he has entered. He tells America clearly what is at stake in the 1964 election. What we are choosing in this time for choosing is not merely this or that candidate, but a way of life and a political philosophy.
Well, I, for one, resent it when a representative of the people refers to you and me, the free men and women of this country, as the masses. This is a term we haven't applied to ourselves in America. But beyond that, the full power of centralized government. This was the very thing the Founding Fathers sought to minimize. They knew that governments don't control things. A government can't control the economy without controlling people. And they know when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. They also knew, those Founding Fathers, that outside of its legitimate functions, government does nothing as well or as economically as the private sector of the economy.
In this passage, among other things, we see Reagan invoking the memory of the Founding Fathers, and of course aligning the Founding Fathers with his ideological position. This not only strengthens and legitimizes that position, but may also implicitly suggest that the Founding Fathers, were they alive today, would be on the side of Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater.
But seriously, what are we doing to those we seek to help? Not too long ago, a judge called me here in Los Angeles. He told me that a young woman who'd come before him for a divorce. She had 6 children, was pregnant with her 7th. Under his questioning, she revealed her husband was a laborer earning $250 a month. She wanted the divorce to get an $80 raise. She's eligible for $330 a month in the Aid to Dependent Children program. She got the idea from 2 women in her neighborhood who'd already done that very thing. Yet any time you and I question the schemes of the do-gooders, we're denounced as being against their humanitarian goals. They say we're always against things, we're never for anything. Well, the trouble with our liberal friends is not that they're ignorant. It's just that they know so much that isn't so.
Now here's another passage where the central rhetorical technique is narrative. It is Ronald Reagan telling a story, and he's offering that story secondhand. It came to him from a judge. But then notice he draws out of the story, as he has done on other occasions, the central ideological message or the central philosophical principle involved or portrayed in the story. We see in the end of this passage Reagan speaking in political terms that should seem familiar to anyone who's just gone through the 2020 presidential election. Well, the trouble with our liberal friends is not that they're ignorant, it's just that they know so much that isn't so.
Well, what of this man that they would destroy? And in destroying, they would destroy that which he represents, the ideas that you and I hold dear. Is he the brash and shallow and trigger-happy man they say he is? Well, I've been privileged to know him when. I knew him long before he ever dreamed of trying for high office. And I can tell you personally, I've never known a man in my life I believed so incapable of doing a dishonest or dishonorable thing. This is a man who, in his own business, before he entered politics, instituted a profit-sharing plan before unions had ever thought of it. He put in health and medical insurance for all his employees. He took 50% of the profits before taxes and set up a retirement program, a pension plan for all his employees. He sent monthly checks for life to an employee who was ill and couldn't work. He provides nursing care for the children of mothers who work in the stores. When Mexico was ravaged by the floods in the Rio Grande, he climbed in his airplane and flew medicine and supplies down there. An ex-GI told me how he met him. It was the week before Christmas during the Korean War, and he was at the Los Angeles airport trying to get a ride home to Arizona for Christmas. And he said that a lot of servicemen there and no seats available on the planes. And then a voice came over the loudspeaker and said, any men in uniform wanting a ride to Arizona, go to runway such and such. And they went down there. There was a fellow named Barry Goldwater sitting in his plane. Every day in those weeks before Christmas, all day long, he'd load up the plane, fly it to Arizona, fly them to their homes, fly back over to get another load.
In this passage, we see Reagan characterizing and portraying the candidate who he's speaking for, Barry Goldwater. And he reveals something about Goldwater's character in a very epideictic fashion by telling us something that Goldwater has done. He doesn't praise the virtues of Goldwater directly, but he tells us the story of things that Goldwater did as a business owner. And from those things, we derive the implied virtues attached to Barry Goldwater. And Reagan tells us the story of Goldwater flying soldiers from Los Angeles to Arizona. And again, Reagan doesn't tell us what virtues these represent, but we draw those conclusions ourselves. And we see, here's a man that shares many of the values that we have. In this way, Reagan is moderating the public image of Goldwater as he had been portrayed in the media, that is, as one who was a right-wing extremist.
You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? Just in the face of this enemy? Or should Moses have told the children of Israel to live in slavery under the Pharaohs? Should Christ have refused the cross? Should the patriots at Concord Bridge have thrown down their guns and refused to fire the shot heard round the world? The martyrs of history were not fools. And our honored dead, who gave their lives to stop the advance of the Nazis, didn't die in vain. Where then is the road to peace? Well, it's a simple answer after all. You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance. And this is the meaning, in the phrase of Barry Goldwater, peace through strength. Winston Churchill said the destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we're spirits, not animals. And he said there's something going on in time and space and beyond time and space, which, whether we like it or not, spells duty. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness. We will keep in mind and remember that Barry Goldwater has faith in us. He has faith that you and I have the ability and the dignity and the right to make our own decisions and determine our own destiny.
Now here in this passage, we see Reagan doing something that we talked about Martin Luther King doing in his I Have a Dream speech. We might call that voice merging. In any case, it's Reagan invoking the words and the names of iconic stories from the past. In this first sentence, for instance, he quotes directly from Patrick Henry's Liberty or Death speech. Is life so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Patrick Henry went on to say, forbid it, Almighty God, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. But Reagan adds on to that the names of Moses and of Christ, and of the story of the patriots at Concord Bridge, and of the honored dead of World War II, who defeated the Nazis in Europe, and of Winston Churchill, whom we know well, connecting and associating his name and his words with the thoughts and words of Barry Goldwater. So there is our examination of the speech that launched Ronald Reagan's political career, his 1964 campaign speech for Barry Goldwater, A Time for Choosing. As we close here, I'll invite you to post any comments or questions you have on the Reagan speech on the discussion board, but I'll leave you with the brief eulogy spoken by President George Herbert Walker Bush at the state funeral of Ronald Reagan.
Why was he so admired? Why was he so beloved? He was beloved first because of what he was. Politics can be cruel, uncivil. Our friend was strong and gentle. Once he called America hopeful, big-hearted, idealistic, daring, decent, and fair. That was America, and yes, our friend. And next, Ronald Reagan was beloved because what he believed. He believed in America, so he made it his shining city on a hill. He believed in freedom, So he acted on behalf of its values and ideals. He believed in tomorrow. So the great communicator became the great liberator. He talked of winning one for the Gipper, and as president, through his relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev with us today, the Gipper, and yes, Mikhail Gorbachev, won one for peace around the world. If Ronald Reagan had created a better world for many millions, it was because of the world someone else created for him. Nancy was there for him always. Her love for him provided much of his strength, and their love together transformed all of us, as we've seen renewed seeing again here in the last few days. As his vice president for 8 years, I learned more from Ronald Reagan than from anyone I encountered in all my years of public life. I learned kindness. We all did. I also learned courage. The nation did. Who can forget the horrible day in March 1981? He looked at the doctors in the emergency room and said, "I hope you're all Republicans." The good book says humility goes before honor, and our friend had both. And who could not cherish such a man?